So I think there are a couple big opportunities. I think it starts with making sure that either individual companies or collaborations like Transcelerate articulate an end-to-end strategy, right? So patient-centricity shouldn't just be about point solutions in different parts of the clinical trials enterprise, but there ought to be a vision for what end-to-end patient engagement looks like that includes patient groups' input into the development of that end-to-end strategy. So what do I mean by that? It shouldn't just be about, well, how can we make people more aware so that they could enroll, or it shouldn't be about how can people communicate via social media during a trial, and it shouldn't just be about how do we get them the results, but it should be all of those things. If we're going to ask more of them, if we're going to ask them to participate in trial design, then we should be able to engage with them during the trial in a way that we haven't in the past. If we're going to ask to monitor them via sensor wear and gadgets and tablets and phones 24/7 over the course of a clinical trial, the way we have in the past, and ask them to share all kinds of data and their electronic health records, then we owe it to them to get them their trial results in a timely fashion. So I think two pieces is one, an end-to-end strategy, which includes their input. And the second is to do as much by collaboration as possible. Because I think for each individual company to create their own solution is just going to layer more complexity and more burden on patients than less. And so that's why I'm thrilled to see that Transcelerate has taken up this as one of their core work streams.
We do a lot of this in the rare disease space, and I think there what we try and focus on is the idea that every patient is quite individual, and you want to try and have patient input all along the process of the clinical trial pathway, particularly in the planning stage actually. You can learn huge amounts from patients when you're trying to plan a clinical trial protocol and try and appreciate the burden that protocol will have on them. And this means you can hopefully build a trial which will work better for the patients themselves, and that in turn should increase the compliance on the trial itself. I think there are a lot of things that people can learn from rare diseases because there's that need for the patients themselves to be more engaged from the off. Because it's so hard to find people interested in these diseases, the patients have had to form these groups. Often, you know, you're talking about 20 patients in a country, but they do come together and try and drive things forward. And because of that, my sense is that the rare disease research field is a little bit ahead of some of the other areas of research in patient engagement, in designing new endpoints that are patient-focused, that work for what patients are looking for, in making sure patients have a say and feedback into trials as they're running and after they've run, so people can learn from them there.
Obviously, I think last year, I think also at PCT even, a similar question was asked about trends in the industry, and I think I commented on the patient-centric approach is certainly that everybody is focusing on, and I don't think it's really quite clear in what direction things are evolving right now if it comes to patient centricity. I mean, eventually I think every project is focused on patients because you need to recruit patients, you need to bring them to the study to complete your research project. So I think maybe it's a new term that we invented that always existed, and maybe because we are adding a number of new tools and apps and approaches and discussions to the topic, it becomes its own category, but I would say it's not new. And I would say it is quite important, and I think it will continue to reshape the way we look at the execution of clinical trials for the next few years, and the role the patient is playing, and I think also how we are engaging with patients as CRO, as pharma company directly, and the role the investigator is playing. I think we're going to see a revival. I don't really think anybody today would be able to say how that's going to look like. Contrary, I also think there's a lot of talk about technology. I think we also as industry have to be careful to not just look at technology for the solutions as it is about patient-centric approach, because in the end there's this idealistic patient who is going to the doctor and participating in the trial, but there's also many patients who are not able to operate technologies and who are able to participate in this for reasons of conditions. So we have to be broader, and I think sometimes I'm missing that a little bit in the patient-centric discussions, because you're quickly arriving at technology and databases and web portals.
You know, when I came into the industry, we were, in my mind, very, very patient-centric. We consulted patients when we were developing our protocols. I think that we have, to some degree, been distracted by the sort of regulatory hurdles that we have, the different needs in the disease areas too. And I think what's happening now is that pendulum effect, whereby we're actually realizing that we've been a little distracted on other things, and we need to give patients more time and more involvement into clinical development. So it's encouraging for me to see that through social media and other avenues today, that patients do have a voice, and they're making sure that they have a voice, and that we within the pharma industry really need to be more à l'écoute, or listening, as the French would say, to make sure that they are involved in the early stage. So I think the pendulum is swinging back to make us more patient-focused, and I'm reassured by what I've seen at PCT and other conferences that patients are having that voice, and we will come back to them and we will make sure that they are a key stakeholder, as they should be, in clinical development.
The way that clinical trials can really improve in regard to their patient-centricity approach is in relation to how they convey the information to patients about the nature of the clinical trial which has been undertaken. And I think I'm a very big critic of the current approach in the industry towards research subject information sheets. There are two criticisms I would have. One, the language can often be very technical in nature. It's very difficult for people to understand. Now, you could argue that people who are, suffering from advanced conditions, like leukemia and things like that, they would have a very good awareness of their condition. But generally, patients who are being made subjects of a clinical trial won't have that great degree of understanding. And I have felt in my role as a chair of a research ethics committee, but I'm also a legal advisor to a number of research ethics committees in Ireland. The problem we find is that the information is put in very technical detail and can be very difficult for a patient to understand. I mean, the very basic concept of informed consent is the patient can understand, retain and comprehend the information that's being given to them. That's the first problem I see at the moment. The second issue is the sheer length of some of these documents. Sometimes you get almost like a telephone directory's worth of information. And again, I think that's very difficult for patients to assimilate. Now, you could argue that the pharma industry are going very much towards the letter as opposed to the spirit of the law, and they're probably being advised to do that. But I don't think that is a good result for either the pharmaceutical industry or the patients who are going to be the subjects of the clinical trial. So that's one of the big issues I see, one of the big challenges for the pharmaceutical industry in this area.
First off, they can do a better job of defining patient centricity, and they can do an even better job, having even a greater challenge of being able to come out of their silos to embrace patients. One of the things that we look at, one of the work that we've been trying to do, particularly here in Europe, is to get the pharma industry and healthcare establishment in a lesser degree to be able to understand the role of centricity in terms of patients from the standpoint of initial drug development, clinical trial recruitment and initiation, to downstream care. The problem has come, from my perspective, that we talk a lot about it, but we don't really know how to do it. It's always something someone said, we've got to have patient centricity because that's the buzzword right now. But how do you execute it? How do you really embrace the patient and get them to become part of your basic strategy? And the problem is that we are all in silos. We all think alike and work alike based upon whatever culture of our companies, our establishments, our organization. We don't really get out into the street to talk to the patient, to see what the patient really needs, wants, how they respond to the things that we put out here in terms of drugs, in terms of protocols, in terms of therapies, in terms of how we think about them. We look to say that we're going to have this drug that's going to meet a certain patient need. But are we really meeting the patient need, or are we really meeting a marketing challenge? We're looking at a share of market issue. We're looking at a downstream production of a new derivative. So again, we have to go back and start looking at what does the patient really want. We have to be able to start talking to the patient in terms that they understand and in terms that they really want to respond to us. Too often we'll do a trial and we'll find that it only has applicability for certain groups of patients because we haven't done a good enough job initially of finding out what patients really want to respond to. So I think it's going to be the challenge for pharma and all of us going forward to really embrace and engage the patient where they are.